Hello, and welcome to Bovine Banter podcast with Penn State Extension Dairy Team. I'm Angela Breneman, Dairy Management Educator for Lancaster County, and today I'll be your host. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the basics of a farm transition plan. Farm business transitions from one generation to the next are crucial for the survival of any family farm. A successful transition requires careful planning, financial and legal considerations, and personal and emotional considerations. According to Horizon Farm Credit, 78% of people intend to pass their business to their children, but only 34% create a succession plan, while 1% of businesses survive to the fourth generation. Mike Peachey, CPA from Acuity Advisors, will be joining us today and giving us some tips on how to transfer our farm businesses successfully to the next generation. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today. This is a conversation I'm excited to have with you, as this is something that I've been through in my own business and know it can be a difficult topic to discuss with family. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what you do and a little bit about your background?
Sure, yes. And yes, thank you, Angie, for the invitation to be on. Appreciate that. And I'm a CPA and partner with Acuity Advisors and CPAs, and I lead our firm's agribusiness services practice. And at Acuity, we certainly do the traditional accounting firm services, but also walk alongside our clients through the life cycle of their business, which many times is startup and then a growth stage, and then eventually a exit transition. Sometimes that's externally, but most times it is internally to family, which has given us a lot of opportunities to help with ownership transition plans. And my role at Acuity is to spend a lot of time in this space of transition planning and consulting services around the life cycle that a business goes through. And for me personally, I'm passionate about it because about transition, because I'm a strong believer that family businesses are the backbone of our communities. And I think it's important to help these family businesses transition to the next generations, because they are such a important fabric of our communities. And it's a real honor and privilege to be, walking alongside families through that process.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I totally agree. I think family farms are the backbone of our community, and you guys have worked with a lot of farms, right, at Acuity?
We have, yes. Yep.
You've seen
Yep.
a lot of different types of situations and a lot of different types of unique operations, right, with dynamics with farms and family. So when we think about creating a farm transition plan, let's go back to the basics. What exactly is a transition plan and who should be creating one?
Okay. So at a very basic level, a transition plan is an outline or framework of what you intend to happen or expect to happen with the management and ownership of the farm. And the first thing I would say is that there's not necessarily a cookie cutter solution for every family and every business, because every family is unique and every business is unique. So it's important to recognize that up front and just know that there's going to be nuances with every plan. But I think there are a few guiding principles that can be somewhat like a North Star guiding the way through the process. And I would say there would be two broad components to this plan, which again is your expectations about what you want to have happen. And the first component is, I would just characterize it as the soft stuff. which is all these things about communication, expectations that the older and younger generation have, relationship dynamics within the family, and then also things like management and who's going to do what and how that's going to change and evolve over time when, as human beings, just like cows, we are creatures of habit. And so breaking out of those habits when there is a transition can be a real challenge. And that requires, I think, a heavy investment in figuring out what, again, for lack of a better word, I'll call the soft stuff. So that's component number one in the plan. And then the second component is what I would just call the mechanics of the plan. And that's much more of the legal structure, the financial stuff, and the tax stuff that goes along with that. And there you're relying heavily on expertise in the legal, accounting, and personal financial planning professions. But at the end of the day, it's basically about a plan is basically laying out what is the outline of what you intend or expect to happen. And as far as who should be creating one, it's never too early to start. And I think, we might talk about this a little bit later on, but, I could say, well, everyone should have a succession plan or transition plan. Maybe that's too much of a generalization, but certainly to narrow that down a little bit, I would say anyone crossing over age 50, if you're in that older generation of age, as you're crossing over age 50, in your business, I think that's a good time to really begin thinking about it. And that may seem too early for some because you may think you have a lot of time, and you do. But the best practices that I've seen are those owners that have been intentional about thinking about it 5 or 10 years ahead of time, and thinking about it that early, because it's a good time to start asking, what do I need to do now to position my farm 5 or 10 years from now? So an example would be, where do I need to be getting from a debt perspective to make the transition feasible? Or do I need to grow the business so that it's in a better position 10 years from now to be able to fund a buyout? And then also, from a management perspective, what do I need to do? What do I need to be doing now to make sure that I'm passing on whatever knowledge I have about operations, about management of
Yeah.
the business?
Yeah.
I would say it's not necessarily too early to be starting as you're crossing over that age 50 mark. And the second thing is, Angie, is there's a life cycle that every family business goes through. And that typically is a 30-year cycle where every 30 years, that ownership should turn over.
Okay.
And that's important because, if you're age 30 and you're buying into a business, you want to have that paid for so that by age 60, you can be turning that over, hopefully, to the next generation.
Yeah.
And if you get started too late, you start to get pushed for time to be able to be in that natural 25 to 30-year cycle. So my advice is that to start early and make time your friend, not your foe, in this process, because having a long enough runway just gives you a lot more planning flexibility and options.
Yeah, and I like what you said about you're never too young to start the process. It doesn't mean you have to complete the process, but you're never too young to start the process, right?
Yeah, and even
I
thinking about it, and
yeah.
and even, not that you'd be starting the process, but I've seen starting early in ways like in your 30s, diversifying. You're not, you're just getting into ownership, but it can be really helpful in your 30s already to be investing in some funds outside of the business into basically starting to diversify some of your investments outside the farm, whether that's into IRAs or retirement funds, whether that's into rental properties, whether that's into maybe some other land that's not critical for the operations.
Mhm.
But I've seen that be real beneficial for when that 30-year-old gets to be 60, and now they have funds outside of the farm that they can lean on for their retirement, and not their entire retirement is tied up in the farm, which just again gives a lot of flexibility. So I go back to starting early, even doing things like what I just said of diversification earlier in life can really help on the back end.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That makes me think about my own farm business at home and what my husband and I are doing for diversification. So we'll touch a little bit more about diversification and some generational challenges later on. But that brings me to my next question. You know, that's a lot to unpack, right? And I think sometimes that kind of scares people off from transition planning because it is a lot and there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of things to go through. There's a
Mhm.
lot of information to dredge up. And I think that statistic kind of really resonates with me that only 34% of business owners create a succession plan. Hopefully those numbers continue to grow. But what really is the importance of a farm transition plan? I mean, if we're just sitting around the table and we write a handwritten note of agreement of what's going to happen, I mean, what's the best way to go about this, right? Why is it important to get everything written down, to look at all aspects of the business and just have a solid plan in writing going forward and not just kind of barn table talk?
Yeah, no, good question. And it is a real challenge, and the hurdle is many times time, because we do get filled up with the dailies of life of running a business, of running a farming operation. And that gets to be a real challenge to set time aside and to be intentional about thinking about transition. But I would say the importance of a farm transition plan, number one, is it helps to take this concept, which is very intangible when you just start to think about transition, but to take that intangible concept and make it as detailed and hopefully as tangible as possible so that it really does become this blueprint or roadmap for how you get from where you are today to where you want to get to be down the road. So it does force you to be thinking through a lot of details that are important on that roadmap. And getting a plan on writing in writing does force a farm owner to think about, not only think about, but also communicate about what that plan is. So it forces discipline around making the plan as detailed as possible. And I think perhaps even more importantly is I think it sends a really good signal to the next generation that the older generation is serious about doing a plan. Because a lot of times the next generation doesn't know or is left wondering about what the plan is, or if there even is a plan. And I think it's very encouraging and motivating for the next generation if they see the older generation start to put a plan in place. It really, I think, is helpful for that next generation to see that they have a future there at the farm. And then it also forces conversations. And sometimes those conversations can be easy. Sometimes those can be tough conversations, to what you had alluded to before.
Absolutely.
And those conversations about expectations. At the end of the day, everyone has expectations about what something should look like. And the older generation has expectations about how something should be. The next generation has expectations about how something might be. And it's important to get those expectations out on the table so that we can assess, is there alignment about those expectations? And so the process forces the communication about those expectations and forces the assessment about whether those expectations are aligned or not. We're having a conversation right now with one family where there's somebody that's coming back to the farm, and we will be going through expectations in a very detailed fashion, because in this case, it's just really important to understand those expectations that each party has. And
Yeah.
then finally, it forces the family to think through about all the legal the tax and the financial implications about the process and how it's going to work.
Yeah, definitely is something that's important for survival of the business, right? Especially if there's lots of moving parts and multiple families involved.
For sure.
Uh,
And it's an investment.
Yeah,
It's an investment of time and also dollars. But if it's something that is truly important to a family and as difficult as it can be, why not make the investment, right?
yeah, investment for the future, right?
Yep.
So we talked a little bit about generations and challenges, and we'll dive deeper into that a little bit later. But it can be tough, especially when working with family, to have conversations sometimes. I know in our family, if we're not talking about the cows, we're generally not sitting down and having long conversations about things. So what are your tips to get conversations started? I mean, you have multiple generations that have very different thinking sometimes. Some families, that is an easy thing to do to sit down and have a conversation, and some families it's not. And some minds are more open than others. So I would say for the people that are worried about having a conversation about transition plans with family members, what are your biggest tips to get that conversation started, and where should they start?
No, it can be really difficult again because of the dailies, the tyranny of urgency. We just focus on things that are urgent and not necessarily long-term things. So I get it. It can be a challenge. But the first I would say is to be disciplined about being intentional. And intentional means getting things on a calendar. This is when we're going to sit down and talk about it. And I've seen the best time to do that typically is in that January, February, March period when things are slower.
Hmm.
And it is easier to pencil in regular times to be getting together to talk about transition. So be intentional and get it on calendars, and then stick with those times. I think about how to get the conversation started could many times also depend on someone's ability and gifts as a communicator, and can also depend on the relationship dynamics.
Yeah.
And if a family is good at communication, if that's been modeled by previous generations and that has come more easily for families, and that there's healthy family relationships, then I think it facilitates, makes it easier to have those conversations. But if communication is a challenge, and again, I acknowledge it's not always easy, or if there have been some challenging family dynamics, which again occur,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
that I would say that's normal.
Yeah.
Then sometimes or many times in that situation, seeking somebody out to be a facilitator of those conversations can really be helpful, again, with the intentionality. Because if you have a scheduled time on a calendar with a facilitator, it's a lot harder to back out of those commitments then. And that
Yeah.
facilitator can really help to hopefully draw out communication and facilitate things that need to be said, even if those things might be difficult. And I would say if you're the older generation, my challenge to you would be, hey, I think it's your responsibility, if not obligation, to lead the way and not wait for the next generation to bring it up.
Yeah.
Not that the younger generation does not have responsibilities in the process, but as the quote unquote leader of the business, that is your leadership responsibility.
Yeah.
And I would put that challenge out to folks listening on the podcast if they see themselves in that older generation. And maybe you have to talk to somebody first about how to get it started. And it would be somebody that you trust and
Yeah.
that you can have regular dialogue about. And it might take you a while. It might take you a couple of years to take this first step after just talking about it, which is why you want to get started on it early. But that could be anyone from your nutritionist who you see regularly, who you trust and have a long-standing relationship with. It could be your veterinarian, could be your accountant or CPA. Many times talking with a friend who's already been through it can be really helpful. And even, in a spiritual context, it could be even your pastor if it's something that you feel you're being led to really want to focus on.
Yeah, probably not Sunday supper or the Christmas dinner time to discuss conversation
Correct.
with family about farm transition, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let Thanksgiving be Thanksgiving, let
Yep.
Christmas be Christmas, and then do this outside of those times.
Yeah, farm transition and politics. We don't talk about that at family supper,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, no, you bring up a really good point about it doesn't have to necessarily be a stranger. It's great to talk about people with their experiences and what they found. I also just want to point out too that there are lots and lots of resources on farm transition planning now. You can find a lot on the Penn State website, on the extension website, but my husband Aaron and I tell this story all the time, Mike, about how we found Acuity and how we got started with you guys as we attended Dairy Summit. We
Mm.
attended Dairy Summit and you guys had a presentation on farm transition, and we were just dabbling into things at the time and trying to figure out how to get the conversation started about doing farm transition. And we just happened to listen to one of your sessions at Dairy Summit. So there's tons of resources, there's tons of avenues for farmers to learn about transition. So they are definitely not alone, but it doesn't have to necessarily be a stranger. It can definitely be someone who's been through the process that you trust. So
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
that. So when I think about me personally going through the transition plan and when we're helping producers with their transition plans at Penn State, there's kind of three aspects that I think of when starting a transition plan. So that would be goals, legal issues or entities, and business. They're kind of broad, but when we think about what we want to have in our transition plan, the bare bones, those are the three things that I think of. So, can you expand a little bit about what your thoughts are about what needs to be in each one of those categories?
Sure. Yeah. And I think those three categories, goals, legal, and business are good is a good framework and a good outline. And again, as I said earlier, there's not a cookie cutter approach because every family and every business is unique. But I think chunking it out into these components is a good framework for approaching process. And under goals and objectives, that first category, yeah, I think it's important to flesh out and put in writing what are the goals of the older generation, what are the goals of the younger generation. And
And
typically,
we're talking about goals for the business, right? Like, so what each generation's vision would be for the business.
it could be for the business, but also for them personally as well.
Okay.
So yeah, certainly the business is a big part of this, but for personally, it could be, for the senior generation, it can be, what I would just like to be able to have less time commitment and time away because there's other
Good
things
point.
that I want to be focusing on in this next season of life.
Yeah.
Given that the farm takes up so much time during our vocational years, I've seen many times that just not being tied down is a significant objective of the senior generation.
Yeah.
And financial security and stability in the next season of life, having a cash flow that allows senior generation to do some things that they have not been able to do before.
Mhm.
That might be travel, it might be some home improvements, it might be the kitchen that's been waiting for 30 years. But those things many times percolate to the surface as a goal and objective for the senior generation. And then again, in the non-business side of it, the another goal for the senior generation could be wanting to be fair to non-farming children.
Yeah.
And how does that play itself out through the transition process, which gets into, what's into estate planning. And if we're giving a price break on the farm to the farming children, how do we be fair? Fair does not mean being equal, but how do we be
Right.
fair to the other children? And then also, what level of involvement does the senior generation want to have in decision making? And can they move towards a role of being a sounding board and kind of a mentor role for that next generation? And the goals for the younger generation be things like growth, for the business because they do have aspirations, professional goals of what they'd like to see that dairy become, and decision making and time commitment as well, because how their parents dedicated time to the farm and maybe less to family may look different to the next generation than it looked like to the parents. And I'm hearing
Right.
that as a recurring theme
Yeah.
in this next generation. And we have that in our profession as well, in the CPA profession. So it's not something that's unique just to farming.
Yeah.
So I think getting those goals on the table is really important. And again, are those goals aligned is an important assessment. And sometimes those goals can be in conflict. So an example is the senior generation might want stable cash flow, understandably so, and they may not want to be at risk anymore.
Mhm.
Yet, in order for the next generation to put up that new barn or put up a parlor or whatever, that may mean that's going to mean maybe the senior generation has to go behind the bank in the collateral in terms of the bank getting first dibs on stuff.
Yeah.
And so now that next generation, or the senior generation getting paid is subject to the younger generation making bank payments.
Right.
And so that's where those goals can be in conflict with each other, and you're in this murkiness of and that have to get sorted out.
Yeah.
Then on the legal piece, what is the right legal structure? What is the right entity structure to have? How do you want to have the operating assets owned? How do you want to have the real estate owned for either liability protection, for ease of transition to the next generation, for ease of estate distribution, to get to that fairness for non-farming children? And then as part of that legal structure, doing that in a way that's also built around income tax efficiency is also a big consideration. So those are the things that go into that legal component of that framework. And then finally, the business or financial framework are things like what financial commitments can be made to the senior generation, the retiring generation, without handcuffing the next generation.
Yeah.
And that's a big nut to crack.
Yeah.
And what is the right debt load? What is the right commitment to make to the retiring generation without the next generation feeling handcuffed, like they can't do the things they need to do to remain competitive going forward? And so financially, you have to model that out and say, well, what is the right number? What is the right commitment? What is the right balance there? And what does the cash flow look like to be able to make that happen? And what are the key drivers to be able to make that happen? Is it production? Is it feed efficiency? Is it overall management? What are those key performance indicators that need to get managed and get driven day in, day out?
Yeah. That's a lot of good points. We know that all farm situations are unique. All businesses are unique, especially if they're family run. So what else would you say should be included in a good plan, quote unquote? So we have the basics here, and I think that covers a broad spectrum
Sure.
of what needs to be in there. But is there anything else that you would add besides those three categories to make a good plan?
I would add two things, and they're not financial, they're not legal, they're none of that stuff. It's two things. Number one, accountability, and number two, grace.
Okay.
Accountability in terms of do what you say you're going to do.
Yep.
If that's a senior generation, if you say you're going to follow through and move forward with this, then be accountable to the next generation to make it happen. The younger generation needs to be accountable to be good managers and to make things happen and take responsibility away from the older generation.
Yeah.
So accountability is really, really important for really both sides of the equation. And then the other thing is grace. No one is perfect. Both generations are trying to figure it out.
Yep.
It's something they don't do day in, day out, and both may stumble from time to time. When that happens, it's just important to show some grace in those situations. I think it just really helps the process, and I've seen where grace has been shown that just has helped with the overall process.
Yeah, I like that. I like those two additions. I think that's good for both sides of the
Hmm.
transition process to hear.
Hmm.
Who should be involved in the decision-making process? So we know that things get pretty involved in looking at, the dynamics of the business and who's running the business and making the decisions now and who's going to be making the decision. But when we're kind of in that gray area, that no man's land, who should be involved in the decision-making process when looking at a farm transition plan?
I think as you're going through the transition process, I mean, certainly, naturally the business owners, the older generation and the next generation are part of that process. And if there's things that come up that just make it difficult to be able to communicate, then getting somebody else involved in that process to be a facilitator and to help to identify, well, who's making what decisions can be helpful. It's not always needed, but there are resources, again, like you had said, out there that can help families navigate that space of no man's land.
Hmm.
And you can't be in no man's land forever.
Yeah.
Business cannot take that for too long. So it is important to be able to navigate through that space. My opinion, it's important to have spouses involved. There's probably two categories of spouses. Some spouses are involved in day-to-day operations. Some spouses are not and have other vocations, other professions, and are really not involved at all.
Right.
I think it is important to have spouses involved in maybe not all the meetings, but certainly some of the meetings in order just to help with the communication process. Because otherwise, there's conversations in the evening. Well, what'd you talk about?
Right.
And then how the recap of what got talked about loses, I think, a lot in the translation, or it can anyway,
Yeah.
lose both in content and then also quality of content
Yeah.
that gets passed along. And I think that the more a spouse is aware of what's happening out of respect for that relationship, I think it can be really, really helpful in the process.
Yeah.
So I think that's who also should be involved in the process. The decision, especially if that spouse is not an owner legally, and again, every couple is different how they go about doing how they go about navigating business and marriage,
Right.
and some they're more quiet about the business side, some it's totally immersed. So I get every relationship is different that way. I think it can be helpful to have the spouses certainly aware of the process in some way, whatever works best for that particular relationship. And then at some point along the way, again, not necessarily decision-making process, but from a communication awareness perspective, if there are other non-family or non-farming children involved, it's helpful to have a recap of, hey, this is what we're doing. Again, not necessarily in all the business details that aren't necessarily their
Right.
business because they're not in the business. But
Right.
again, just from an overall family awareness and family respect and courtesy
Hmm.
is probably the best way I would put it. I think is helpful to be part of the process.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen firsthand how information can be a whisper down the lane type situation.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes.
When, something important happens and you couldn't be there or you wanted to be there or whatnot. And I think you prove a really good point is even if the spouses or children aren't directly involved in the farm entity or the farm business, that it is still important to include them at least as to what's going on or what's going to happen. And I think of that saying all the time, fair is not always equal.
Yep.
And I think of that all the time, keeping people in the dark and not keeping people in the dark, and just making sure that everyone is included in the discussion when it comes to the farm transition, even if they're not directly involved or 100% involved in that business. So that is a really good point.
Yeah, because the thing that can happen is absent being informed, people can make up their own stories about what's happening,
Right.
which is not productive and constructive to the whole process.
Right. And it causes family dynamic issues, right?
Yes,
Which only
yes,
makes this process worse.
right, right, right.
Yes, barring that, everyone's unique and their business is all unique and there could be multiple different aspects and multiple different families to plans. Typically, when someone gets started with a farm transition plan, so not just having the conversation, but actually going to someone and saying, we are ready to create a farm transition plan. How long does that process normally take on a basic kind of level?
Yeah, so once you're ready to go, again, depending on the situation and size and scale of the operation, typically I think you'd want to give it a year. It can take longer if there is a lot of complexity to the asset structure or again, the size and scale of the operation. Typically, it takes about a year to do it right. If somebody wants to transition a business, let's say January 1 of the following year, you work backwards from there, and you really ought to have a very well laid out plan to be able to give to the attorneys by about October 1 to give attorneys adequate time to do all the legal drafting that needs to be done, because there could be deed transfers, there could be operating agreements, there could be forming new companies. There's just a lot of legal work that needs to happen. And accountants have their busy season in,
Mhm.
February, March, April.
Yeah.
Attorneys have their busy season in October, November, December, because there's
Yeah.
so much transactional stuff that happens oriented around the end of a calendar year or the first day of the following year. So then working backwards from there, in order to put together a plan, you really ought to be starting in that early in the year to be able to work through what that plan looks like and have that very well articulated by about the end of August.
So now we get into the mental and emotional section of questionings. I know sometimes it can be hard for generations to work together, or it's just hard in general working with families sometimes. Different mindsets, different goals, like we just discussed earlier. Sometimes people have different visions for how the farm looks, 10 years from now. And I've seen it on both sides, right? I understand what it's like and how hard it is for the older generation to pass on their legacy to the younger generation and what they've worked for years, what they've put their blood, sweat, and tears to. And I can see it from the younger generation side too, as wanting to take this business and help it to continue to prosper and grow. Things are different. There's new technologies, there's new management ways, there's new systems that can be put in place. And sometimes change is hard, right? Like you said, we are definitely creatures of habit. I see this quite often when we look into value added aspects of the business. And, if we're trying to support multiple families, what are some ways that we can bring in some extra income that aren't necessarily related to the dairy, but they're going to help profit the individuals of the dairy or help profit the dairy itself as well? What do you suggest if there's a lot of disagreements on either side or on both sides, the transition process? Where do you suggest that they go, or who do you suggest that they talk to? I know we discussed a little bit earlier, possibly involving a mediator into the situation, but what else can generations do to kind of sit down and just get on the same plane?
Very challenging question, because I think it takes a lot of work and commitment to be able to get to the other side. I think partly it depends on how those disagreements or difficulties have been addressed before. Some families, I mean, they're very open with their disagreements and their conflict, and they're not afraid to tell each other how they think, which can
Mhm.
actually be a good thing because it gets out onto the table and
Yep.
has an opportunity to be addressed.
Yeah.
Now, if that's done in an unhealthy way, that's not productive. But if the conversations can be direct, it can be, I think, actually a healthy thing for the relationship overall, as long as they don't turn into unhealthy or unconstructive name calling and that kind of thing.
Right.
So that's not what I'm talking about. But if there's a pattern in the family of communicating well, albeit directly with each other, that can actually be a good thing and is frankly a process for dealing with the conflict. If not addressed and just always gets swept under the rug, then that little hump under the rug ends up growing into this huge hurdle that everyone keeps tripping over. And so where do you go when you have those situations? Frankly, I think a good approach is to engage a third party facilitator, somebody who's has some background or experience in that space, particularly in the family business space.
Yeah.
And there are various organizations out there that specialize in that kind of thing. And there are resources within the industry and within the family business space that help. And I think that's a very, very good place to start if you just cannot get it resolved on your own, or if you just want to have an objective third party to help keep everyone focused on what needs to happen.
Yeah, I think when emotions run high, I think having a neutral party there to kind of keep
Agreed.
everyone on track is a great idea.
Agreed. Yes. And I think it's also appropriate to be honest and make an honest assessment. If there are some significant relationship dynamics, there is nothing wrong with asking the question, is it healthy for us to continue forward with this process? Is it
Yeah.
healthy for us to be either business partners together or indebted one to the other financially if there's just really, really difficult and challenging relationship dynamics? And a lot of pain can go with that,
Yeah.
clearly, and a lot of dreams can get flushed if that's the outcome. It's not taken lightly when I say that, but sometimes an honest assessment could be healthy for the broader family relationships as well.
Yeah, most definitely. Again, being through this process and seeing both sides, there's two things that I usually think of. When I see people struggling with communication or with just different generational challenges, is I tell people to set boundaries and be open-minded at the same time for both sides. As a younger generation, we have to respect that the older generation has their views and their visions for the business that they've already created. So we have to be open-minded to their ideas as well. And same goes for the older generation. They've built this great success. And a lot of times, I can't say all, but the younger generation appreciates and accepts what they've built so far and just want to improve upon that. So I tell people we have to set boundaries, especially if things start to become super toxic, and maybe
Mhm.
not so healthy as a family dynamic because of working on this business transition, but to also be open-minded,
Mhm.
and just listen to each other. But I do also want to just make a point that there are lots of places, like you had mentioned, that are just geared to helping these situations. So you're not alone. Please do reach out to some organizations for help, especially if you're needing help in the mediator side of things or facilitator side of things, so you can have a good conversation with family.
Well said.
Wrapping up here, Mike, should farms get help creating a plan? And who can they go to for help? You know us farmers, if we can do it ourselves, we want to try and do it ourselves. Or we're not about
Yes.
to spend money and we're not about to spend time. So when it comes to something like this, there are some pieces that we are going to have to reach out to certain organizations for, right? The lawyer stuff, we can't get around that. But should we be sitting down at the table and writing down a plan ourselves, or should we be reaching out to consultants or CPAs or lawyers or mediators to sit down and write these plans?
Should farms get help creating a plan? Yes. So two things. Number one, start early. Number two, get help.
Yep.
I think you can do a lot of helping yourself by thinking through what your goals are. I think that's really, really helpful and can help in the process and can save some money if you're able to think through and articulate individually and then together what your goals are. But anymore, the dollars are too big and the business tax and financial landscape has become too complicated to do it all yourself.
Yeah.
There's an old Oldsmobile car commercial that said, "This is not your father's Oldsmobile, and this is not your father's transition plan,"
Yes. Yeah,
which maybe 30, 40 years ago, it was fairly, I should just say simpler, just to go to the lawyer's office and sign some papers on
right.
maybe one page and it was done.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, land prices go higher, certainly cattle prices now higher. There's just, and then family dynamics. How do you put a price on that? Family relationships, put a price on family relationships. I would encourage anybody going through this process to get help. And I think it's a team of individuals that are on that team to support and drive the process. So as you said, yes, it's the attorney, it's the CPA or accountant, It can be consultants, particularly if an expansion is part of the process and understanding what that future cash flow looks like. And it can be a financial planner for the senior generation around things like what do they need in retirement financially? What should life insurance be part of the picture? What happens if they need to go to a retirement community? Those are really, really good questions that a good financial planner can help address.
Yeah.
Decisions about when to start drawing Social Security, health insurance, if you're not quite yet at the Medicare age.
Yeah.
Those are all things that's important to have a good financial planner on the team. And I think it's important to have a quarterback of the process and somebody who's a quarterback and almost a general contractor to say, hey, how do these different pieces fit together?
Yeah.
So that it's a congruent plan across legal, tax, financial, personal financial planning, so that going down one road for legal purposes, let's say, doesn't cost a bunch of money for tax purposes, doesn't cost a bunch of tax money. So it is important to make sure that the plan is well coordinated and well put together for having a good, efficient plan.
Great. Well, Mike, thank you for chatting with us today. You gave us a lot of good tips on where to get started with farm transitions. So just a few key takeaway points. When we're thinking about transitioning business over to the next generation, that's generally when we want to start thinking about a farm transition plan. And every farm and family and situation is unique. So each plan is going to look different for that individual business operation and farm. But getting a conversation started with both generations and parties and setting goals for yourself, for your business, for the future, looking at what the business is going to look like in 10 years from now financially, and also talking about legality issues and land and things like that are all conversations to start with and to kind of sit down and talk about when starting that transition process. And there may be other avenues or a part of that process as well, right? If we're talking about business diversification or outside income sources or adding family members in. So there's lots of moving parts and things that need to be in that plan depending on your business. And just remembering to be open-minded, and if you need to seek help, things get to be a little bit challenging, but there's lots of avenues and resources out there to do that when doing a plan. I just also want to mention that if you have questions on farm business transition plans, you can find articles on the extension.psu.edu website. We actually have a whole farm transition team at Penn State. So if you have any questions or don't know where to start, or this podcast sparked some interest in farm transition, you can give us a call. You can call myself at the Lancaster Extension office at 717-394-6851, or you can meet me in the office in person and we can chat what the next steps are for your business. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of the week. You can join us next Tuesday on Bovine Banter for our next podcast on farm diversification and business transition.